I'm Madeline Blair, and this is Unlocked, a show all about opening possibilities so that when you're hit with the unexpected, you've got options from which to choose. Today, I am thrilled because we're going to have as my guest Sarah Miller. She is a grief and loss coach. She's an end-of-life doula and even more. She's an expert in helping individuals and groups deal with something that we all feel very uncomfortable about, namely grieving. Whether it's for a friend or a colleague, or maybe something that happened to someone else, but it just touches our heart. So I want you now to stay tuned. Welcome back. This is Unlocked, and we're talking, or will be talking, with Sarah Miller. But I want to just tell you a little story about one of my consulting engagements. The client and I were working together. I really enjoyed the way he approached things. He knew what he needed to get done. He brought me in knowing that I could help with that, and he treated me like a colleague. That's what you want as a consultant, that kind of relationship. Well, I went in one day and discovered he had died over the weekend, quite suddenly. I was shocked, and I looked around and I could see that his staff was shocked as well. Really sad. I was deeply sad because it was not only did I lose a client who was becoming a friend, I lost his support, I lost his perspective, lots of things in that job. But mostly I lost him. When I arrived, as I said, the staff were also feeling the same way. We were all grieving, and I have to admit that for one time, at least, I watched human resources step into a situation and really help everyone. They talked about what could be done to help both the staff and the team itself, that's different, the individuals and then the team, to come to some kind of resolution and healing from that event. Well, we'll be talking about some of those techniques and getting even more advice, but this time we're going to bring in Sarah Miller. Sarah, welcome to Unlocked.
Hello, thank you so much for having me today.
Oh, I'm so happy to have you. This is, I have to tell people, Sarah and I met quite recently at, of all things, a memorial service of a mutual friend. And I said, this person has something to say. So she's now here to do that. All right. There's one thing that I didn't say in my intro to you is that you are a parts work practitioner. And I thought that was just fascinating. But what is this parts work?
Great question. So the best way I can describe it is to ask you a question, which is, have you ever had a part of you that wanted to go to the gym in the morning and a part of you that said, I don't want to go to the gym?
Oh, yes. I think I can recall that quite vividly.
We all can. It is a very universal experience.
Yeah.
So that's on a very basic level, parts. We all have thousands of different parts of ourselves that we can actually dialogue with. You can actually talk to the part of you that doesn't want to go to the gym and say, hey, part, why don't you want to go to the gym today? What concerns do you have? What are you feeling? What would you rather do? And actually listen to what they have to say back to you. And then you can do that with the part that wants to go to the gym and negotiate. There's lots of things you can do with parts. But on a very high level, it's a great way of getting to know yourself and what's going on within yourself and connecting and above all, parenting yourself and learning how to reparent your inner children, which are also parts.
Ah, wow. I always love learning new ways of doing things. And this is, I've been doing that sort of thing, but now I have a name for it and I can go at it even more aggressively. So thank you for that, Sarah. Yeah. Well, I understand that at a fairly young age, you lost your entire family and your mentor. How did that affect you? And tell us about that a little bit.
Yeah. It affected me in every way. Profound loss can possibly affect you. And to start, my first loss actually was the most rite of passage that you can have, because it happened on my 21st birthday during my last semester of college. I got the call that my dad had passed away unexpectedly from a pulmonary embolism. And that moment is it's your first major loss on the precipice of adulthood, of moving into a new phase of life. And it was one of the most earth-shattering moments in a way that really, now looking back on it, I feel like it set me up for life, because I was able to see what was really important at a very, very young age. At 21 years old, I could see that the time that we spend with people, the way that we live our life, the love that we give, the good that we do, these are the things that really matter, because at the end of the day, we're all leaving this earth the same way, via death, and it's something that we're all going to experience. But in that loss of my dad, I started getting really very interested in what happens after death, and what is the process of dying like, reading all these books with psychic mediums and blogs and theories. And in that process, a couple years later, my grandpa got pancreas cancer. So I got to be with him actually at the moment of his death, and sit and vigil with him and hold his hand, which was another deeply profound experience, because I realized that the actual experience of death is scary, and also it's something that doesn't need to be feared. You don't need to miss it or run away from it, because being with my grandpa in those final moments and holding his hand and kind of watching him go through this very laborious process of exiting this world was deeply profound. And that's what catapulted me onto this journey of, oh, now I've researched a lot of what happens after we die, but what about the dying process? I want to be an end of life doula, which I'm not even sure how I figured out what that was at the time, but I did. And I went on to study my doula training and learning about the process of dying, and as such, the process of grieving, and how to hold space for grief, and how to be with grief, your own grief and other people's grief. And then as I was finishing my doula training, I got the call that my mom died of a drug overdose, also unexpected. And then I became the primary caregiver to my grandma, who I took care of through the pandemic, moved her from Buffalo to DC. And it was, again, a different angle of the death experience, because I went from, unexpected loss to expected loss to traumatic loss to becoming a caregiver at 24 and taking care of my grandma for years, 3 years, and kind of seeing what it's like to both the joy of getting bonus years with somebody who I got to have an awesome relationship, and how hard that is, and how hard it is to alienating, isolating it can be to be a young caregiver. And she ended up passing away in August. And then my most recent, and I swear the most last profound loss of my life, because I don't want any more, I am done with losses for now, was our mutual friend and my very, very close mentor, Joe Mancini, who was kind of, when I think about my journey through loss and death and grief, I feel like Joe is my capstone project, because he knew he was dying from the moment I met him, and we became friends through cleaning out his house, and which I'd done plenty of times with all the other losses. And then this beautiful friendship grew, where we'd spend every weekend together, and we'd go sailing and do these things and adventure around the DMV area. And I made a promise to him, which was, Joe, you might be dying, but you're still living. And I'm not going to let you forget that you're still alive, and we're going to keep living until you're not. And we did for 3 years. We kept living and doing these things. And then his disease progressed. He had kidney disease, and he passed away in January, to which I got to be with him and hold his hand and be in that beautiful experience of transitioning from one world to the next.
Wow. I think you just got a PhD in
I've had all the angles.
Yes. Well, I really want to commend you that you are still smiling and still energetic and it's great. My next question is just sort of seems almost obvious, but how did that inspire you to help others in this?
Yeah, it's interesting because, to be honest, I kind of resisted the idea of being a grief coach or a doula for a long time. I wanted to study it and I was really interested in it. And any Uber or any place in the whole world, the conversation always turned to death and loss and grief, no matter who I was talking to. And it was kind of through that I knew I wanted to help people. That's always been something that is important to me. And I wanted to be able to work one-on-one with people, which is kind of where my coaching training came in. But every time I talked to people, I would be hearing them talk and I realized, oh, you're experiencing grief, and they wouldn't even know it, right? Like I'd be talking to a client about their business and how they lost, they lost a lot of money, for example, or lost a portion of the business through divorce, and how they're having a really hard time with that, and them not even realizing that what's actually going on is this experience of grief, and being able to help guide them and acknowledge it, that give it a name. Giving things name gives you power over them.
Absolutely. Oh, that's remarkable how you just sort of naturally migrated into this with clearly all the preparation that you could possibly need.
The universe was like, this is what you're doing whether you want to or not.
One of the things when I was reading about you is that you said a healed people heal the world. I loved that phrase. I wonder if you'd just expand on this and tell us a little bit more about what you meant by that.
Yeah. The first time I heard that too, it sung a beautiful chorus to me, because you think about trauma, right? You think about, and more specifically about generational trauma, which is trauma that we pass down through our ancestral line. And a lot of times that happens because from a place of not having the awareness and support that people need to be able to heal from that trauma, to find, like what you talk about, to find that inner resilience and heal themselves. But when we are able to reflect and get the support we need and understand what's going on within ourselves and how our inner worlds reflect our outer worlds, our outer relationships, when we're able to do that, we then start to become what we want, become the change we want to be in the world, right?
Yeah.
It's through my own healing that I'm now able to have a healed relationship with my partner or with my friends. And I believe in me being able to heal myself and have a healed relationship that will give a model to the other people in my life, in the world, about what it looks like to show up in your trauma, in your experiences, and be able to still be kind and to be a human and to be empathetic and understand. So I think we all have a personal responsibility to work on our own healing, because it's going to ripple like a butterfly effect.
As you're talking, I'm realizing what that means now to me, that healed people heal the world. Because when you have healed yourself, and I know it's never perfect, but as you do that, you're not putting a burden on other people. Because normally if we're in difficult situation, we do lean on people, because that's part of what society is about, that we help each other. And the more you have attained your own healing, the less you have to lean, and the more you can give them support. I really like this.
Beautifully. I love the way you describe that. Beautifully put.
Thank you. Well, let's get into some of the specifics of grief. I mean, we've talked about it kind of generally. What does it look like? And what are the coping mechanisms that you suggest for individuals?
What does grief look like? Everything and nothing. No, I'm just kidding. There's Kubler. I think we have to address it. I'm sure almost everybody knows Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. But what most people don't know is that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief is actually the 5 stages of dying. So she was this profound, amazing human who did a lot of research in the end of life space. And I think she was a nurse. And she identified through the process of dying that people went through these 5 stages, which was, I'm not going to list it out because I always get it wrong, but it's like bargaining, denial, acceptance, so on, and anger, so on and so forth. And it is a beautiful model for what people go through when they're facing their own end of life. And it has often become very misconstrued in society that you have to go through those 5 stages to grieve properly. And if you don't hit all the stages, you're doing it wrong, or if you do them in the wrong order, something's not right. And that's just not the case. Grief looks like a million other things than those 5 stages. And you can go, it kind of looks like this, right? It's like all over the place. One minute you can be happy and joyful, and the next you smell your mom's perfume and you're crying, or you're at the deli counter and the guy's taking a long time and you start screaming at him and you're like, where did that come from, right? So grief can really show up mentally as anxiety, depression, sadness, numbness. Even with people who have been caregivers, it can be a feeling of relief, which is often very surprising to people. It can show up physically. So grief gets stored in the body. Emotions get stored in the body if we're not moving them out, or if we're not creating space for it. So a lot of times people have headaches, trouble sleeping, aches and pains in their body, just general discomforts. And sometimes those can last chronically for many years, and people don't even realize it's from that grief you experienced when you were 9 years old. I remember after my mom died, my spine, I could barely stand up straight. I was in so much pain, I couldn't walk. And I was 23 or 24. I shouldn't have been, I was young.
No, not supposed to happen then.
Oh, and I did, during my doula training, we did a grief ritual, a grief ceremony where
You know what I want to do? I want you to define that word doula, because people may not know it.
Yeah, so a doula is a spiritual companion through periods of transition. So a doula could either be a birth doula or midwife, somebody bringing you into the world, and it can also be somebody helping you transition out of the world.
Thank you.
Yes. When I was in the training, we were doing a grief ritual where all the doulas gather in a circle, and you have professional mourners, and there's music, and you just hold each other while grief comes up. And it was so beautiful. And I ended up just crying for like an hour, I think, straight, just screaming and crying, and sweating, and letting all of this out. And when that experience was over, I stood up and had no pain in my body. Wow. It was profound. It was amazing. So that's just an anecdotal way of saying grief does get stored in the body, and you can move it out if you do some somatic processing. It can also show up in loss of attention or not being as present in your life. But at the end of the day, if it's something you're feeling, weird about, or like this wasn't who you were before, it's probably has something to do with grief, especially if it comes after a traumatic loss.
Excellent. Sometimes I know I confuse the word grieving with mourning. Is there a difference, or those words mean the same thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So grief and mourning, they can go hand in hand. And grief is the internal experience of loss. It's what you feel internally when confronted with death or loss, or all sorts of things that come from grief. Mourning is the physical act of grief. So it's the expression of grief. It's letting it out. It's movement, or it's talking, or drawing. It's the verb of grief.
Thank you. Thank you. I finally know it now. It's the verb of grief.
The verb, yes.
I like that. Well, now let's talk about some examples. I know that when we hear in the news of an airline crash, or of children being victims of gunfire, that's a specific thing that we might grieve for the moment. But then there's the less defined. I noticed that in 2021, I began to see people acting different. They were unsettled. They were confused. They were angrier than I've ever seen people be. Was all kinds of things. Are these, and I think you were saying this, these are some of the kinds of behaviors we would see if people were, say, grieving the pandemic?
There was a lot there, just in general, over the past however many years, there's been a lot of things to grieve, and some of which you mentioned. And there is something called collective grief, which is the experience of a group of people or a nation. It can even be with your story, Madeline, at the beginning, you and your coworkers were experiencing collective grief of your friend who passed away. And I think a lot of people in our who lived through 2001 are very aware of collective grief because of 9/11.
Yes.
But what I think happened with the pandemic is that was probably the biggest experience of collective grief maybe since World War II, in a very long time, right? Because it affected the entire world. Everybody was touched by that loss. And it showed up differently for different people because there were nuances to that grief, right? For some people, COVID was hard because I have never been alone with myself, and now I'm stuck in my apartment for months on end with only my thoughts and my dog, who now has anxiety because they lived through a pandemic, right? For other people, it was hard because I'm trying to raise children and I'm in this house with like 5 people, and I'm watching my kids lose their experience of prom or elementary school or being with people, right? And for others, it was I have to go to a hospital every day and experience secondary trauma of other people, of watching people die and families be separated. So though we were grieving on a collective level, there was very fine nuances to the types of and why people were grieving and what about the experience brought up that grief.
Wow. Collective grief. New phrase for me. Thank you. We've talked about individual grieving. With the collective grief that you talked about, how can we address and heal from this kind of shared emotional burden in society?
It's a behemoth question. I think the way that when you look at, when you go back to ancient civilizations or to more tribal civilizations, or even like groups of elephants do this, we grieve in community. Like grief was never meant to be an individual experience. Grief is meant to be a communal experience. And you think of that, even it is ingrained in our memorial rituals, right? Funeral services tend to bring a lot of people together. Shiva services in the Jewish faith, right? You sit together with your family for a week and people come. And you see that in many other forms in religions, right? And I think that's part of what the pandemic robbed us of, was this ability to mourn together, because we couldn't be. It was too dangerous to be together. We were with COVID running rampant. So and then the world just kind of kept going, right? And I was actually, as we were preparing for this conversation, reflecting on how that often mimics an individual's experience of grief. Because, for example, if your husband dies and they are part of your life for 50 years and then they die, you have a period of maybe like 0 to 6 months or a year, maybe even, where people are around you, you have support, people are bringing you meals, And then people's life just kind of keeps going, as it does, as it should, right? We're still
Yeah.
alive. But you are then kind of left with this individual experience of, wow, my world just changed completely overnight. And how do I reconcile that with the world going on? Who
Mm.
am I without this person? Who am I in this new way of being? And that's similar to what happened on the collective level of COVID. Is, okay, we had all these people die, all of these, and also a lot of terrible things that came with it, like the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and all of these huge cultural things that happened. And then we just kind of moved on. And I think we're all, if we all just got together and talked about the fact that we're all probably like that widow who's saying, what is happening? Like, how are we just going back to work now? And how are we just riding on the metro now? How do I went through a big period of change, and how does this new version of myself exist in this world? Right. And that conversation, I think one of the ways to start healing is to just have that conversation with people and just be like, and Madeline, how has that affected you? And kind of living through this, and then
Yes, I did, and I was extremely fortunate that my work had been virtual for many years, so I didn't have to abruptly change the way with the place in which I worked. I also was very fortunate in that I live in the country, so that when I felt confined, I would go out and walk in the garden. But I think it was the interaction with people that their ebullience was gone, and I'm a person who generally is ebullient, and I was running out. It was sort of like I was running out of gas because I wasn't getting anything back, and that was hard. That was hard, and I think even today, my sense when I am in a crowd that there is it feels different to me. I have always thought of America as a very friendly place. And I've worked in international arenas for years and years and years, so I see the differences. And now I don't see that same naturalness of friendliness. So to me, that's a real loss. So I think I may be still grieving a little bit of that loss. Yeah.
it sounds like it. Absolutely.
I don't know how to bring that back, other than to do things like this, which is help people explore the topic. Yeah.
Absolutely. The hardest part is to acknowledge what's going on, to name it, right? And in doing that, you get power over it.
Actually, your question has helped me. Yeah, because I haven't articulated that until now. So thank you for that. Now it gives me something to think on and chew on and ask my parts. Who's feeling bad?
Ask the parts. They always have they have so much to say. They'll always give you something.
Oh, goodness. Well, we've talked about this on two huge individual and then on this big global perspective. But there's another perspective of grief. And that was the one that I really began with, this aspect of in our work, because it affects our career shifts, our relationships. How do we navigate all these intersections as we're going through this healing process and prepare to really keep coping with these changes? Because we do, most of us do work. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I can first of all speak from my personal experience of going through 5 major losses early in my professional career. And something that really made a big difference for me is I had a very, very supportive team that stepped, they may not have always had the right words or known what to say, but they did create a structure and level of support that was such, I didn't lose my job. I didn't fall behind in my career, that when I asked for help, it was given.
Okay.
Right. So I think a lot of times having experiencing grief in the workplace really starts on that micro team level, like your immediate people who you work with. And, you know, and it also probably helped that I'm a grief nerd and I could educate, and at the time was building grief products for my job, and I could educate my team through the process of what I needed, and I could advocate for myself, which I acknowledge not everybody has that, or, you know,
No.
knows where to start with that. But and on the flip side, I've had a lot of people come to me who say, my coworker's dog just died, or my whatever, such and such happened at a job, or my friend just got laid off, right? And how can I support them? Like, that's probably the number one question I get as a death doula and a grief coach, is how do I support other people who have gone through loss? And what I always say to them is, don't ever underestimate the power of simply holding space.
Yes.
And what I mean by that is, holding space is being present in a non-judgmental way, in a way that's not trying to fix, problem solve, and just allowing a person to experience what they're experiencing. That was a big part of my doula training, is we'd have to sit and listen to people talk about and their death and how they feel about it, and then not say anything in return. And that's really hard. But in doing that, what that gives the other person is, first of all, there are so few of us who've ever truly got to experience holding space, like being space held for in a very like open and non-judgmental way. And it allows people, kind of like what you just did, Madeline, was to express what it felt like to live through a pandemic and how that's still affecting you today. Being able to get what is flurrying around in the mind and let it out, and in a way that I'm not trying to problem solve for you or like change it or any of these things, allows it to be released physically.
You know, as you're talking, I keep thinking about this aspect of holding space. For years, I did a lot of facilitation of teams. People would also often bring me in because they had a problem with the team, or it was a new team and they were forming it. And as a facilitator, you're not in there to solve their problem. You're in there to create a space and hold that space, so that within that space, they heal themselves and solve their problems. So when you talked about this, I could really relate to this aspect of giving someone a space and holding it for them so that they can do their own work. That's exciting. The other thing that occurred to me was, in my work in resilience, one of the things that resilient people almost always have is good social support. You know, they have whether it's a team, whether it's a family, whatever it is, friends who, when the chips are down, will support them, encourage them. And the non-judgment is a really important part of that. Yeah.
And I also want to just share how to do that in a practical way, because I know we're talking, a lot of this conversation is very theoretical, which but on a very practical level, how to support your friends, family, or loved ones through times of loss. Be curious. Ask questions. Don't be afraid to say, oh, what do you miss most about your loved one? Or how is your grief feeling today? Like, a lot of times we ask how things are feeling in general, which with grief, it's like, it's a crapshoot. It could be great, could not be, right? But how is your grief showing up today? You can ask questions. Oh, another one that there so often we want to help. Like, humans want to help each other. People want to give help and support. But sometimes when people are grieving, it's very common to say, how can I help? Anything, just tell me anything to help. I don't know what I need help with. I personally, like, I've lived through 5 losses, and I still don't know when somebody dies. Like, I don't know, I need some food. I don't know, right? Because you're just not in the right state of mind. So a way you can sometimes help that, or actually help somebody, rather than giving it open, how can I help? Say, Oh, I'm available to take your kids to class tonight. I'd be happy to bring lasagna or tacos. I'd be happy to walk your dog today. Like giving them actual specific
Mm,
actionable things that they can need help with is really, I mean, if you do nothing else, just give them one option. Even less options is better because grief brain's a real thing and people don't want to make decisions in that time.
I love this. It says to me that in any situation, whether it's in my family or whether it's at work or a stranger on the street, if I can ask the question specifically, uh, can I make you a cup of tea? Um, can I help you across the street? I know you have that report due on Friday. Uh, can I do table 3 for you just to give you a little review? So those are the kinds of things you're talking about. Yes.
Absolutely. And it doesn't need to be complicated. Like it doesn't need to be giving people hundreds of dollars or a complicated thing. I cannot tell you how much just somebody taking out the trash for you helps when you're in the throes of immediate loss.
Yes.
Or really,
Yeah.
that just a little thing like that, it's one less thing that you have to think of, right?
Yeah. You know, it's interesting you say that because 12 years ago, my husband had triple bypass surgery. Well, it was very touch and go there for a while, and we live on a place that has a lot of lawn that has to be mowed, and it was such a relief to come home after the hospital and see that friends had come and mowed the lawn and they weed whacked everything, so it looked better than we even keep it. But just that simple act was just so appreciated.
Yes, that was me with snow blowing in Buffalo. That was the best thing ever.
Oh goodness, that's a great one.
And something else really quick I want to bring up is grief. I like to call myself grief agnostic. So a lot of times we think of grief as somebody dying, but and what you just shared, like my husband had triple bypass surgery. There's some grief that comes with that, right?
Oh yeah.
It can look like divorce, losing a friendship. It can look like good things, like, oh, I just had my first baby. This is the most joyful thing in the world, and like, I now only see myself as a mother and like a feeding machine, right? Or getting married and losing your identity as a single person into a coupleship. So grief can really it touches just about every human experience in some way, even the good ones.
And the good ones. Well, now speaking of which, how does one? Well, oftentimes in this, I know I've met many people like this who they don't even want to talk about how they feel when it comes to grief. How does that do you as an individual assess? Oh my goodness, I don't feel it, but I think I need to go see a professional for some help. What would be some of the signals that you would suggest people be alert for, whether it's themselves or maybe it's a colleague, that, hey, you need some professional grief counseling?
Well, I'm a pretty big advocate, like always get help, no matter what. So if you have like a very clear green flag of I need help is if you've experienced any big life transition, divorce, death, marriage, baby, like it's probably a good idea to see a therapist or see a coach or talk to a friend even. But some more serious warning signs, if you notice any sort of like deep depression, suicidal ideation, that's always a red flag. Or people acting differently or making comments about leaving the world or things like this, that's always a very clear sign that immediate help is needed. Like call the paramedics if you think it's dire, or just say, I think you really need to see a licensed clinical therapist. But some less clear signs, because there's grief therapy, which is with licensed clinical therapists, and there's grief coaching, which that's my modality that I practice in. And therapy is going to be more probably acute loss, like right after the loss, kind of processing, maybe going in to look at the past patterns and behaviors. Grief coaching, my primary clients, most of my clients come to me maybe a year or more after a loss. And maybe it's not as clear about how grief's impacting them, but they know it is. Like maybe they really want to find a fulfilling relationship and their dad passed away, and they're noticing this pattern of that they keep repeating, and they want to explore that. Or somebody's mom passed away and they're having a lot of panic attacks at work and they're not really sure why, but kind of exploring where that's coming from and realizing, oh, I have a lot of ajaju with my mother that I still need to process and heal. So it's a lot of, and a lot of times people aren't aware of the impact that grief's having on their current life, but a good indication is if there's somewhere you want to be and you've tried a lot of things, you've tried therapy, you've tried meditating, you've tried X, Y, and Z, and you're still not getting there, that's probably a pretty good indication. Maybe I need to explore this deeper. And maybe it's grief holding you back or limiting beliefs, or whatever is going on in the subconscious mind. But that's often a good indication that maybe I need to look at something. Also, last, any sort of big, something we should talk about is re-grief, which is we experience grief throughout. Like me losing my dad at 21 doesn't mean that the grief ends at 21. I'm going to re-experience his death when I get married, when I have my first child, when my child graduates from school. So big life events often will stir up old griefs all the time. So if you're going into like getting married and your mom's not going to be there, or even first holidays or Christmas, Hanukkah, these different big events, usually there will be things that are stirred up with grief there, and that might be something to help you prepare for what's to come if you're early on in your grief journey.
Well, that's some great ways to prepare for yourself. Now, how about a leader who has staff? You don't want to think about having grief, and yet there's going to be disruptions, and it could be somebody who leaves, or is fired, or is riffed. Can a leader do anything to really prepare them for that kind of adjustment?
Yeah, my first thing to say is whether you think about it or not, it's happening. Whether you want to think about it or not, your client, your workers are experiencing grief in different ways and different areas of their life. If it's something that's more expected, layoffs are happening, somebody's about to quit, I think the best thing you can do is, as a leader, you can model vulnerability and you can have open and honest communication with your employees, right? I think a lot of times there's this persona of leadership that I need to be stoic. Like I need to have everything together and
strong and together. Yes. In control.
Yeah. When in reality, when people see that and they're going through this emotional turmoil, it's kind of offsetting. It's like, why is that person totally fine and I am not fine, right? So it creates this distance and almost this fear of vulnerability. Like it creates this expectation to show up work in that way. So being able to, in an appropriate way, share how a loss has impacted you, or where you're struggling in your life, is a great way to model vulnerability and create that open communication among your team, and to dialogue with the team, each other, not just up and down, but side to side. Right?
That's fabulous. Brene Brown talks a lot about vulnerability, and we always think of vulnerability as weakness, and in fact, it's great strength to show your vulnerability. And here's an example where it would actually strengthen your team if you do that.
The incidents like this are great. I hate to say it, team building opportunities, but it does create a strong bond between, like, trauma bonding is a real thing, guys.
It does. Sarah, I can't believe our time is up. But I am so appreciative that you have explored this difficult topic for my audience. I really appreciate it very much. You have maybe a couple of words of wisdom that you want to leave them with, and certainly how they can get in touch with you.
Absolutely. My biggest piece of advice is that to trust your body. Your body knows how to grieve. It is literally built to grieve. You are built to release, to shake, to cry, to sweat. Your body is physiologically built to release what's stored inside. And if you can just trust yourself, or first of all, quiet yourself enough to hear what you need and trust what you're hearing and give it to yourself, you are capable of getting through anything and everything, and even the things you thought I never get through. We are the most resilient, one of the most resilient species in the world. And a lot of that begins with just quieting yourself enough to hear and to trust.
Thank you.
Yeah. And if you're interested in getting in contact, you can reach me on Instagram at District Doula, Doula. I also at coachsarahmiller.com.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you. This was lovely. I really enjoyed this.
Good. Ah, gosh. I always enjoy these conversations, even when they are covering a difficult topic. And as I always do, we're going to have a book that I'd like to talk about. And today, my book is called, don't laugh, it's called Resilience: Why Things Bounce Back by Andrew Zolli and Anne-Marie Healy. I've studied resilience for many years. And in fact, I even define resilience differently than Andrew does in his book, because I talk about it as a decision to move on. But I've never examined it in relationship to those times when we are grieving. He did. And he talks about a study that was done when the World Trade Center was attacked in 2001. What he found was that the people who experienced it, who had witnessed it firsthand and had lost someone they loved, were more likely to suffer PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. But the interesting thing that he saw was that proportion of people who suffered that never exceeded 1/3. On the other hand, he found that of those people who appeared more resilient, who managed to get through and move on with their life, at least 1/3 were able to move on, and sometimes as much as 2/3. And he asked the question, why so many people reliably would be resilient? And this is his thought. He says, this pattern of response is so ubiquitous everywhere and so consistent. It begs the question, why are we as a species designed this way? One possible answer is that the design ensures there is always at least a sizable minority or even a majority to take care of those deeply suffering by trauma. I thought that was a fantastic observation and conclusion. And I love the fact that it ties in so tightly with what Sarah was talking about, of how we can support each other. Now, today, I also want to talk about a second book. I just couldn't resist. And this is called The Body Keeps the Score. It's Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma by Bella van der Kolk. It's a big book, and it talks about a lot of things, as they both are. But I want to talk about one example. It's called Keeping Together in Time. It's where he talks about things like choral singing or dancing or marching in step. But he's describing a particular example, and that was in South Africa in 1996 in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That's the place where people who felt they had been traumatized, victimized, abused, whatever, could come and talk about that, sometimes with their perpetrators in the room, so that there could be healing, forgiveness, an amazing thing. Bishop Tutu, when he observed, because he was heading these, when he observed that someone was weeping uncontrollably because they were reliving the trauma, he would interrupt their testimony and lead the entire audience in prayer, song, and dance until the witnesses could contain their sobbing and halt their physical collapse. This enabled the participants to, like it says, pendulate in and out, go back and forth with reliving their horror, and eventually to find words to describe what had happened to them. He says, I fully credit Tutu and the other member of the commission with everything, averting what might have been an orgy of revenge, as is so common when victims are finally set free. Again, this reflection that we can, as a body of people, do things that will help us heal. The body keeps the score, and resilience. 2 for the price of 1 today. Well, gosh, I hope you have, I won't say enjoyed the topic, but maybe enjoyed learning a little bit more about this important topic. Because I want to thank you very much for joining me today. If you have enjoyed it, I hope you will make note of something you learned and might do differently as a result, and post it in social media. And if you're watching on YouTube, click the like button. And if you're curious about the background of this show, by all means, get my book. It's on Kindle, audio, and paperback. And if you'd like to explore what it means to build and nurture your resilience with me, personally, one-on-one, or in a small group, just email me at madeline@madelineblair.com. And be sure to note your insights, as I said. All right. What a show. Thank you again to Sarah, and thank you to you. I'm Madeline Blair, wishing you infinite possibilities as you unlock your resilience.